Crystal McDowell's life was marked by hardship and adversity from the very start. Born to parents who, in a tragic twist of irony, named her after the drug crystal meth, her childhood was anything but easy. When she was just 11 years old, she suffered the unimaginable loss of both parents within 6 months of each other. They had succumbed to complications from AIDS, a consequence of their struggles with substance abuse. This devastating loss left Crystal orphaned, forcing her to navigate life on her own far too early. As a teenager, Crystal faced additional horrors. She was abducted by a man who held her captive in a chicken coop, subjecting her to days of abuse and assault. Yet, in the face of such unimaginable cruelty, Crystal demonstrated remarkable courage and resourcefulness, ultimately escaping her captor and finding freedom. Eventually, Crystal found refuge in Baytown, Texas, where she went to live with her aunt and uncle. Despite the trauma she endured, she resolved to create a brighter future for herself. Determined to rise above her past, she poured her energy into rebuilding her life.
In Baytown, Crystal met Steve McDowell. Steve, with his playful personality, love of video games, and passion for fast cars, seemed like the answer to Crystal's prayers. His kind, sweet, and humorous nature quickly won her heart. Her friends couldn't help but notice how happy she seemed with Steve, and many thought they made an ideal couple. Crystal went on to become a flight attendant with ExpressJet, a job that allowed her and Steve to travel extensively and enjoy the perks of airline life. After marrying, the couple welcomed 2 children, Madden and Maui. Crystal adored her children and was a devoted mother who always put their happiness and well-being above all else. On the surface, the McDowells appeared to be the perfect family, but beneath the facade, cracks began to show. Over time, Crystal became increasingly dissatisfied with her marriage. After 10 years together, she made the difficult decision to end her relationship with Steve. This choice was met with resistance, as Steve was reluctant to accept the idea of divorce. While waiting for renovations to be completed on her new home, Crystal continued to live with Steve and their children. It was a tense and emotionally fraught arrangement, but she remained resolute in her efforts to build a better life for herself and her kids. By 2017, Crystal was 37 years old and had made significant strides toward a fresh start. She pursued a career in real estate and was excited about the new opportunities that lay ahead. She was looking forward to a new chapter in her life, full of promise and hope. On August 25, 2017, Crystal had plans to gather with her family to watch the much-anticipated Mayweather vs. McGregor fight. Excitement filled the air as her loved ones prepared to enjoy the event together. Little did they know, this day would mark the beginning of a tragic turn in Crystal's story. Steve McDowell, who had recently finalized his divorce from Crystal, informed detectives that she had started a new relationship following their separation. He mentioned that there were times when Crystal would leave without informing him of her whereabouts. As Steve spoke, something in his tone caught the attention of the deputy. Relying on his sharp instincts, the deputy began to feel uneasy about Steve's story. Growing increasingly suspicious, the deputy decided to call for reinforcements. A more experienced detective arrived at the scene to assist with the investigation. While speaking with Steve, the detective noticed a peculiar detail. Steve was still wearing his wedding band, despite the fact that he and Crystal had been divorced for 6 months. This observation piqued the detective's curiosity. Although Steve appeared cooperative, the detective couldn't ignore subtle inconsistencies in his behavior. Given the strange circumstances surrounding Crystal's disappearance, the detective reached out to the district attorney. After reviewing the case details, the district attorney immediately suspected foul play. The unusual dynamics between Crystal and Steve, divorced but still living under the same roof, raised red flags. Adding to the complexity, Crystal was reportedly in a new relationship, which further fueled suspicions about Steve's potential involvement. While the district attorney leaned toward the possibility of Steve hiding something, the lead detective on the case kept an open mind. While it was plausible that Steve might be connected to Crystal's disappearance, the detective believed other avenues needed to be explored. In particular, the detective thought Crystal's boyfriend could provide crucial information about her movements leading up to her disappearance. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that Crystal had been out with her new boyfriend, Paul Hargrave, on August 24, 2017. Paul, a well-known figure in the community, managed a local jewelry store that had been a neighborhood staple for over 50 years. According to Paul, he and Crystal had spent the evening together, and afterward, she accompanied him back to his house. Paul claimed that when morning came, Crystal had returned home. Despite Paul's account, Crystal's disappearance remained shrouded in mystery. Investigators were left to piece together the puzzle, hoping to uncover the truth about what had happened to her. While Paul was in the shower, Crystal left his house. Paul later provided security camera footage showing Crystal leaving his residence on August 25th at 7:35 a.m. The video captured her getting into her black Mercedes coupe and driving away from his driveway. Both Steve McDowell and Paul Hargrave were immediately identified as suspects in Crystal's disappearance. However, detectives realized there were still other individuals who needed to be investigated. As the investigation unfolded, the detectives uncovered intriguing details about Crystal's personal life. They learned that during her marriage, Crystal had engaged in multiple extramarital affairs with flight attendants and pilots, both male and female. While these revelations raised suspicions and opened new lines of inquiry, there was no concrete evidence linking these affairs to her disappearance. Still, the possibility of an angry spouse or partner seeking revenge lingered in the detectives' minds. The investigation faced a significant setback when Hurricane Harvey struck Baytown. The massive storm caused catastrophic flooding, leaving half the county underwater. Torrential rains persisted for days, making it nearly impossible for detectives to continue their work. Crystal's disappearance was soon overshadowed by the hurricane's devastation, as countless people lost their homes, vehicles, and even their lives in the storm's aftermath. With the Chambers County Sheriff's Department overwhelmed and its resources diverted to search and rescue operations, Crystal's family took it upon themselves to keep the investigation alive. Friends and relatives worked tirelessly to spread awareness, sharing posts about her disappearance across social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram. They were determined to gather any information that might lead to Crystal's whereabouts. In a breakthrough, one of Crystal's cousins received a message from a friend. The friend claimed to have seen a Snapchat image of Crystal's black Mercedes parked at a Motel 6 near Interstate 10. Acting quickly, the cousin verified the image and recognized the car's license plate. It was indeed Crystal's vehicle. Armed with this lead, Crystal's family immediately notified the police. However, reaching the Motel 6 proved difficult due to severe flooding that had rendered many roads impassable. Undeterred, they resorted to using airboats to navigate through the flooded areas. When they finally arrived at the Motel 6, the sight that greeted them confirmed their worst fears. Crystal's car was parked carelessly in the lot, with the keys still in the ignition. It appeared as though whoever had left the car there wanted it to be found, adding an unsettling layer of mystery to her disappearance. It seemed as though whoever left Crystal's Mercedes in the parking lot intended for it to be stolen. The vehicle was promptly towed to the crime lab for examination. Unfortunately, no evidence was discovered that could provide any insight into Crystal's disappearance. Even Dateline, the renowned investigative news series, dedicated segments to her case. Despite the publicity, no new leads surfaced. A week after Crystal vanished, the lead detective realized that the investigation required additional resources. In the wake of Hurricane Harvey, he sought assistance from the Texas Rangers, who readily joined the effort. The lead Texas Ranger assigned to the case conducted a formal interview with Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband. Steve claimed he had not seen Crystal since the evening of August 24th, when she left for her date. From the outset, Steve's demeanor struck the Ranger as unusual. His body language and lack of visible distress seemed out of place for someone whose loved one was missing. However, Crystal's friends and family continued to support Steve. They vouched for his character, emphasizing his devotion to their children, Madden and Maui, and expressing doubt that he could ever harm Crystal. The Texas Ranger decided to take things a step further and asked Steve if he would be willing to take a polygraph test. Steve agreed without hesitation, appearing confident in his innocence. But the results were startling. Steve failed the test miserably. This revelation deepened suspicions about his potential involvement in Crystal's disappearance. Paul Hargrave, Crystal's boyfriend and another person of interest, was also asked to take a lie detector test. Like Steve, Paul failed the test. The failures of both men to pass the polygraph raised serious concerns for the investigators. The district attorney began to entertain the possibility that Steve and Paul might be working together to cover up the truth about Crystal's fate. By this point, everyone involved in the investigation strongly suspected foul play. The growing consensus was that Crystal was no longer alive. However, one critical question lingered in the minds of detectives. What had truly happened to Crystal, and who was responsible for her disappearance? The question lingered. Where was Crystal's body? If her remains had been discarded in one of the bayous in Baytown, it was highly likely they could have been carried into the Gulf of Mexico, making recovery nearly impossible. Determined to find answers and provide closure for her family, a large-scale search effort was organized. On September 9th, a team comprising the Texas EquiSearch Group and nearly 100 volunteers gathered to search for Crystal. Using a grid-based strategy, the team divided the area into sections, meticulously covering every inch by ATVs and airboats. Despite the collective efforts and exhaustive search, no trace of Crystal was discovered. As the search expanded into the wetlands, the Texas Rangers remained resolute in their pursuit of the truth. They worked diligently to reconstruct the events surrounding Crystal's disappearance and to uncover a potential motive. The possibility of involvement from either her ex-husband or her boyfriend remained under consideration, though no concrete evidence supported this theory at the time. Recognizing the potential value of surveillance footage, the lead ranger instructed officers to canvass the area near the Motel 6 where Crystal's car had been found. They sought homes and businesses with security cameras that might have captured vital clues. Fortunately, several establishments had functioning surveillance systems. The team pored over countless hours of footage, determined to find anything that could shed light on what had happened to Crystal. After hours of painstaking review, the ranger finally came across a key piece of evidence. A security camera had captured footage of a man parking Crystal's Mercedes at the Motel 6 parking lot on Saturday, August 26th at 6:37 a.m. The video provided a clear image of the individual, but the ranger couldn't immediately identify him. As the ranger continued analyzing the footage, he observed the man exiting Crystal's car and walking away from the vehicle. Suspicion grew that the individual might be Crystal's ex-husband, Steve McDowell. Later, footage from a different security camera, recorded 5 hours after the car was parked, revealed another critical lead. A blue Mustang GT, matching the description of Steve McDowell's car, was seen pulling up to a gas pump at a station near the Motel 6. Instead of fueling the car, Steve was seen walking toward the Motel 6 parking lot. His actions appeared deliberate as he looked in the direction of Crystal's Mercedes. This revelation heightened the ranger's suspicion that the man seen parking Crystal's car and Steve McDowell were one and the same. With this new lead, the investigation took on a sharper focus, zeroing in on Steve as a potential key figure in Crystal's disappearance. The Texas Rangers speculated that Steve might have returned to the parking lot earlier to check if Crystal's car had been taken. He had deliberately left the keys in the ignition, seemingly hoping that someone would steal the vehicle. If Steve was indeed behind her disappearance, a question arose. How did he manage to get back home? The distance from the motel parking lot where Crystal's car was left to Steve's house was considerable. Traveling on foot would have been impractical, leading investigators to dig deeper for clues. The ranger decided to scrutinize surveillance footage from nearby businesses and homes, hoping to uncover more details. In the course of their investigation, the ranger discovered footage of a man riding a bicycle along the Interstate 10 service road in the rain around 7:05 a.m., approximately 25 minutes after Crystal's car had been abandoned. The bike's distinctive mag wheels caught the ranger's attention, reminding him of a similar bicycle he had previously noticed in the McDowell garage during an interview. Steve had also mentioned in an earlier interview that he had been shopping at Walmart on the morning of August 26th. Intrigued by this claim, the ranger reviewed the store's CCTV footage. The surveillance video from Walmart, which was located just across the street from the Motel 6, revealed an unusual sequence of events. a man matching Steve's description, dressed in a hooded sweatshirt, was seen purchasing a bicycle with mag wheels and paying in cash shortly after Crystal's car was left at the motel. Armed with this compelling evidence, the ranger brought Steve back to the police department for another interview. During the interrogation, the ranger confronted Steve with the newly uncovered information. However, Steve steadfastly denied any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. Despite his denials, the ranger was convinced that Steve was the culprit. He was also confident that Paul Hargrave, Crystal's boyfriend, had no role in the case and that Steve alone was responsible. Although the ranger believed they had enough evidence to charge Steve with murder, one critical piece was still missing: Crystal's body. Without her physical remains, building an airtight case against Steve would prove challenging. A murder conviction based solely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony is always more difficult to secure. Finding Crystal's body would not only strengthen the district attorney's case, but also provide concrete proof to present to a jury. Beyond the legal considerations, locating Crystal's remains was essential for her grieving family. Her loved ones were in agony, desperate for answers and closure. Discovering her body would help them understand what had happened and begin the healing process. The lack of answers was causing immeasurable pain, and finding her remains could bring some measure of relief. Additionally, troubling reports about Steve had come to light. Several people informed the Texas Ranger that after Crystal filed for divorce, Steve had made disturbing comments about murder and even taking his own life. These statements raised concerns about the safety of Crystal and their two children, Madden and Maui. Fearing for their well-being, the district attorney made the decision to remove the children from Steve's custody and place them under protective care. To encourage Steve to cooperate, the district attorney presented him with a deal. If he revealed the location of Crystal's body, they would consider allowing him to see his children again. However, Steve made a counteroffer. He asked to return home for one night, promising to provide the information and lead authorities to Crystal's remains the following morning. This proposal placed the district attorney in a difficult position. On one hand, agreeing to Steve's terms offered a chance to finally find Crystal's body and uncover the truth. On the other hand, granting him such freedom posed significant risks. The decision now hung in the balance, as every move was weighed with the hope of bringing justice for Crystal and her family. However, the district attorney's decision to allow Steve to return home that night hinged entirely on his willingness to cooperate and uphold his verbal agreement. This choice carried significant risks. There was the possibility that Steve might flee or harm himself, potentially leaving Crystal's fate a mystery forever. Despite these concerns, the DA and the Texas Ranger decided to proceed. The following morning, on September 9th, they arrived at Steve's home. When Steve answered the door, he sat down with the Ranger and the DA to share his side of the story. Steve opened up about his knowledge of Crystal's extramarital affairs throughout their marriage. He confessed that when he confronted her about these issues, Crystal was unapologetic, telling him to stay out of her personal life. According to Steve, Crystal admitted she had sought relationships outside their marriage because she felt he lacked dominance in their intimate relationship. As the Ranger and DA pressed him for details about the day Crystal went missing, they used a carefully crafted strategy of appearing empathetic to put Steve at ease. Their goal was to create an environment where he felt comfortable enough to reveal the truth. Initially, Steve resisted their efforts and refused to discuss Crystal's disappearance. Eventually, Steve confessed. He recounted that shortly before Crystal vanished, they had a heated argument. During the confrontation, Crystal told Steve that she no longer loved him. In a moment of emotional turmoil, Steve admitted to suffocating Crystal. He claimed it was an impulsive act and insisted it was unintentional. After Crystal's death, Steve said he panicked and immediately tried to hide her body. He wrapped her remains in trash bags and placed them in the trunk of her black Mercedes. He then drove to a remote area and disposed of her body by throwing it into a ravine. Steve's willingness to lead authorities to Crystal's remains offered a glimmer of hope amid the tragedy. However, he imposed a condition. He would only cooperate if the death penalty was taken off the table. The DA, aware of how critical Steve's cooperation was in finding Crystal's body, reluctantly agreed to his demand. With Steve's guidance, the Ranger, DA, and Steve set out to locate Crystal's remains. He directed them to Needle Point Road, a narrow path surrounded by dense woods. Eventually, the ranger discovered Crystal's body. The condition of her remains was devastating. Almost nothing was left, a horrifying confirmation of the grim reality. Steve was promptly arrested and charged with Crystal's murder. However, his defense team announced their intent to employ the sudden passion defense. This legal strategy argued that Steve's actions were the result of an emotional outburst caused by Crystal's provocation, potentially reducing the severity of the charges. Under Texas law, the sudden passion defense can lower a murder charge to a second-degree felony. To succeed, the defendant must prove that the victim's actions directly triggered an uncontrollable emotional response, impairing their judgment. If this defense succeeded, Steve would face a sentence of 2 to 20 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. In contrast, a conviction for first-degree murder could result in a sentence of 5 to 99 years in prison, along with the same maximum fine. The use of the sudden passion defense in Crystal's case sparked widespread debate. Critics argued that the strategy unfairly shifted blame onto the victim, undermining their dignity and disregarding the accountability of the perpetrator. Supporters, however, contended that it allowed individuals to acknowledge their actions in the context of extreme emotional distress. The courtroom battle ahead would determine not only Steve's fate, but also how society interprets the fine line between provocation and personal responsibility in cases of extreme emotional outbursts. While the defense sought to highlight mitigating circumstances, the district attorney was adamant that this was a deliberate and premeditated act of murder. To secure a conviction, all 12 jurors had to unanimously agree on the prosecution's case. After a year of pretrial motions and hearings, Steve's trial finally began in June 2019. The prosecution laid out their case, aiming to establish Steve's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. A pivotal piece of evidence was Steve's own confession to law enforcement, which provided a detailed account of the events surrounding Crystal's death. Additionally, CCTV footage showing Steve parking Crystal's car in the motel lot was presented to further corroborate his involvement. In a deeply emotional moment, the couple's young children were called to testify. 7-year-old Maui, their daughter, took the stand and recounted the events she had witnessed on the night of her mother's death. Maui testified that her parents were locked in a heated argument about Crystal being involved with another man. She described seeing her father place his hands over her mother's nose and mouth during the confrontation. According to Maui, her mother struggled to breathe and eventually became unresponsive. After Crystal stopped moving, Maui said her father instructed her to stay in her bedroom and not tell anyone what had occurred. Maui's testimony painted a harrowing picture of the incident, leaving the courtroom visibly shaken. The defense, however, sought to discredit Maui's account. They argued that the young girl had been influenced by Crystal's relatives and was repeating a fabricated story. The defense claimed Maui's testimony was unreliable, asserting that her version of events could not be trusted. Against his attorney's advice, Steve decided to testify in his own defense. Tearfully, he presented a new narrative of what transpired the night Crystal died. Steve claimed that the incident was a tragic accident that escalated from an argument. He explained that, in a moment of frustration and anger, he had tried to restrain Crystal with a bear hug in an effort to de-escalate the situation. According to Steve, Crystal unexpectedly went limp in his arms, leaving him in shock. He maintained that he had never intended to harm her and that her death was entirely accidental. Steve's testimony stunned the district attorney, who found the idea of someone unintentionally suffocating another person through a hug to be implausible. The claim sparked disbelief throughout the courtroom, as many struggled to reconcile Steve's account with the evidence presented during the trial. As the case was handed over to the jury, the DA worried about the possibility of a mistrial. This concern deepened when the jury requested to review Steve's confession video, a move that could signal uncertainty in their deliberations. The prospect of a mistrial, and the need to start the legal process anew, weighed heavily on the prosecution's mind. However, just 1 hour after requesting to view the video, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Steve guilty of murder, bringing long-awaited justice for Crystal. The verdict offered some semblance of closure to Crystal's grieving family and friends, who had endured immense pain and uncertainty since her disappearance. During the sentencing phase, The defense attempted to argue that Crystal's death resulted from a sudden passion, a plea aimed at reducing Steve's sentence. This argument, however, failed to convince the jury. They rejected the notion that the crime was an impulsive act and instead upheld its severity. Ultimately, Steve was sentenced to 50 years in prison. For Crystal's loved ones, the verdict and sentence marked the end of a painful chapter and a step toward healing, though the scars of her loss would remain forever etched in their lives.